They shaved a woman's head for fun, laughing, drinking, and dragging her through the dusty main street like she was nothing. But when the door creaks open and her feared mountain man husband walks in, the whole town goes silent. His boots hit the floorboards slow, steady, like thunder rolling in from the high country. Every man in that room knows he's killed before. Yet instead of drawing his gun, he does something no one expects. He wraps its coat around her shoulders and carries her away. But behind those cold eyes, something's burning, a war between vengeance and mercy. Then word spreads. The same men who shamed her are stealing land, torching churches, and blaming innocents. And now, that quiet mountain man must decide. Will he bring justice with his rifle, or redemption with his faith? As the snow falls over a town built on sin and pride. When every soul deserves punishment, can forgiveness still save them? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The snow fell thick and silent over Cold Creek, coating the rough-hewn buildings in a blanket of pristine white. Icy flakes caught in Ivy Lund's woolen shawl as she made her way down the rutted main street, a woven basket tucked securely in the crook of her arm. The morning air bit at her cheeks, turning them rosy as her breath formed delicate clouds with each careful step. Inside her basket, wrapped carefully in clean cloth, lay strips of venison jerky that Carter had helped her prepare before heading up to check his trap lines. Alongside the meat were little glass jars of healing salves and dried herbs she'd gathered during the warmer months, horehound for coughs, willow bark for fever, and yarrow for wounds. The crunch of her boots in the fresh snow seemed too loud in the hushed winter morning. A pair of miners stumbled out of the boarding house, their faces reddened from drink despite the early hour. Their gazes followed her with unsettling intensity as she passed. "Mornin', Mrs. Lund," one called out, his voice carrying a note that made her spine stiffen. She gave a slight nod without meeting their eyes, quickening her pace. "Too good to talk to honest workin' men?" the other miner sneered. But Ivy kept walking, clutching her basket closer. Up in the mountains, unaware of his wife's discomfort, Carter Lund moved through the snow-laden pines with the silence of a ghost. His broad shoulders were dusted with white as he checked each carefully placed trap, his scarred hands working quickly to harvest what he found and reset the mechanisms. The morning's work had yielded 2 rabbits and a fox, enough to keep food on their table and pelts to trade. Back in town, Ivy paused at the schoolhouse, where Miss Aberdeen was just lighting the pot-bellied stove for the day's lessons. The schoolmarm's face brightened at the sight of her visitor. "Mrs. Lund, what a blessing to see you on such a cold morning," Miss Aberdeen said, reaching out to clasp Ivy's gloved hands in welcome. "I brought you some of that horehound candy you were asking after," Ivy replied softly, drawing out a paper-wrapped package. "For the children's coughs." "You're too kind," Miss Aberdeen said, then lowered her voice. "Little Tommy Jenkins has been struggling something awful with his chest. His ma's at her wit's end." Ivy nodded, already reaching into her basket for one of her precious jars of chest salve. "I'll stop by their place. A warm compress with this might help ease his breathing." The schoolmarm's eyes grew damp. "The Lord surely knew what he was doing when he sent you to Cold Creek, Mrs. Lund." Ivy felt her cheeks warm at the praise, but before she could respond, the sound of boots on the schoolhouse steps made both women turn. Deputy Walt Kersey stood in the doorway, his badge catching the weak winter light. "Well, now ain't this cozy?" he drawled, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he regarded Ivy. Mrs. Lund, always the good Samaritan. The memory of their last encounter made Ivy's stomach clench. The deputy had cornered her outside the general store, his breath heavy with whiskey, as he'd suggested that a woman living so far from town might need more regular protection than a husband who spent his days in the mountains could provide. "Good morning, Deputy Kersey," she managed, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "If you'll excuse me, I have deliveries to make." She slipped past him, feeling his gaze boring into her back as she descended the steps. Through the saloon window, she could see him following her progress, that same mocking smile playing about his lips. The general store sat at the far end of the street, and Ivy forced herself to maintain an unhurried pace, despite her desire to rush through her errands and return to the safety of her cabin. The store's bell chimed as she entered, and Mr. Peterson looked up from his ledger with a genuine smile. "Mrs. Lund, just the person I was hoping to see. That last batch of jerky sold clean out. The miners say it's the best they've had." Ivy managed a small smile as she began unpacking her basket. "Carter's particular about his smoking technique. I brought more, and some of the usual remedies." The trading went quickly, with Mr. Peterson offering fair prices as always. He was just wrapping up the last of her purchases when the bell chimed again. 3 men entered, their boots leaving muddy snow on the clean floorboards. Ivy recognized them from the saloon, troublemakers who'd drifted into town with the railroad survey crew. They positioned themselves between her and the door, their postures calculated to block her path. The tallest one, a man with a patchy beard and tobacco-stained teeth, grinned at her. "Ain't you a sight for sore eyes, Mrs. Lund?" he said, his voice carrying that same unsettling tone she'd heard from the miners earlier. "Been hoping to run into you." Mr. Peterson straightened behind his counter. "Gentlemen, I'll thank you to mind your manners in my store." The second man, wearing a frayed coat too thin for the weather, laughed. "Just being friendly like with the lady. Ain't that right, Mrs. Lund?" Ivy gripped her now empty basket, her knuckles white beneath her gloves. The third man had moved to lean against the door frame, effectively cutting off her escape route. Through the store window, she could see Deputy Kersey watching from across the street, that same amused expression on his face. He made no move to intervene. The moment hung suspended like the snow outside, heavy with unspoken threat. Ivy lifted her chin, calling on every ounce of dignity she possessed. Up on the mountain, Carter was going about his honest work, unaware of the malice gathering around his wife like storm clouds. But Ivy knew she couldn't rely on her husband's fearsome reputation to protect her now. She would face this trial as she faced all others, with quiet strength and unwavering faith that good would prevail over evil. The 3 men watched her, their expressions growing darker at her continued silence. They were used to women cowering before their intimidation, used to their victims showing fear. Ivy's calm demeanor seemed to anger them more than any show of terror would have done. Her quiet strength was a rebuke to their weakness, and they knew it. In that moment, the tension in the store crystallized into something dangerous, a collision between Ivy's gentle dignity and the bitter spite of men who couldn't bear to be shamed by a woman's righteousness. The scene hung there, balanced on a knife's edge of possibility, as the snow continued to fall outside, covering Cold Creek in its silent white shroud. The tallest miner took a step closer, his tobacco-stained grin widening. "Seems to me a lady ought to be more sociable." "Step aside, please," Ivy said, her voice barely above a whisper. She clutched her empty basket like a shield. The door chimed again. Deputy Walt Kersey sauntered in, brushing snow from his coat shoulders. "What's all this commotion about?" "Just getting acquainted with Mrs. Lund," the miner in the thin coat said. "She ain't being very neighborly, though." Kersey's boots scraped across the wooden floor as he approached. "Now, boys, you know Carter Lund's wife thinks herself above the likes of us common folk." His words dripped with mock concern. "Ain't that right, Mrs. Lund?" Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. "Deputy, these men are blocking my doorway. I'd appreciate—" "Old man," Kersey cut in, "I reckon you'd best see to your bookkeeping." His hand rested meaningfully on his holstered pistol. The storekeeper's face reddened, but he stayed behind his counter, shoulders slumping in defeat. Outside, a small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Through the window, Ivy could see Miss Aberdeen hurrying across the street, her face pinched with worry. "Such pretty hair you got," the third miner said, reaching for Ivy's braid. She jerked away, but found herself backed against the counter. "Ain't seen such fine golden hair since I left back east." "Don't touch me," Ivy said, her voice stronger now despite her trembling hands. Kersey stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "What's wrong, Mrs. Lund? Too proud to let honest men admire you?" His fingers brushed her cheek. "Your mountain man husband leaves you alone too much, if you ask me." Ivy slapped his hand away. The sharp crack seemed to echo in the suddenly silent store. Kersey's face darkened. "Boys," he said slowly, "I believe this woman needs a lesson in humility." Everything happened at once. Rough hands seized her arms. Her basket clattered to the floor. She heard Miss Aberdeen's voice from the doorway. "Stop this at once!" But no one moved to help. "Hold her still," Kersey commanded, pulling out his pocket knife. The blade clicked open. Understanding dawned. "No," Ivy gasped. "Please, no." The miners laughed as she struggled. Kersey grabbed her braid, sawing through it with his knife. The pulling sensation made tears spring to her eyes. Then came the rough scrape of scissors. Someone had fetched them from the store counter. Cold air hit her scalp in patches as they hacked away, tossing golden strands to the floor. "Stop!" Miss Aberdeen cried again. "For God's sake, someone help her!" But the gathered townspeople stayed frozen, faces turned away in shame. Only the wind moved, gusting through the open door to scatter Ivy's shorn hair across the floorboards like fallen sunlight. Kersey stepped back, admiring his work. "There now. Ain't so high and mighty anymore, are you?" The miners released her arms. Ivy reached up with trembling fingers to touch her head. Where her thick braid had hung past her shoulders, she found only ragged tufts. Tears rolled down her cheeks as chunks of her butchered hair drifted past her feet. The whole street had fallen silent except for the howling wind. Ivy looked at the watching crowd. Neighbors she had helped with medicines, children she had tended through fevers, women she had comforted in childbirth. They all looked away. Something hardened in her chest. She straightened her spine, though her whole body shook. Without a word, she walked past her tormentors, past the shame-faced onlookers, past Miss Aberdeen's outstretched hands of comfort. The snow had picked up, stinging her exposed neck as she made her way out of town. The 3-mile walk home seemed endless. The wind cut through her shawl, but she barely felt the cold through her shock. Her feet carried her automatically along the familiar path, up into the hills where her cabin waited. By the time she reached home, the light was failing. She built up the fire with numb fingers, then sank into Carter's chair beside the hearth. In the window's reflection, a stranger stared back, a woman with red-rimmed eyes and crude, uneven patches of hair sticking out at all angles. "Carter," she whispered, her voice breaking. She needed his strength, his quiet fury, his protective presence. But he wouldn't return from his traplines until tomorrow at the earliest. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls of their snug cabin. Outside, the wind continued to moan through the pines like a living thing. Ivy touched her shorn head again, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Carter," she whispered once more, this time like a prayer. In the growing darkness, she sat motionless except for the trembling of her shoulders as she wept, her dignity wounded, but her spirit unbroken. The night drew in around her, but still she sat, waiting for dawn, waiting for her husband's return, waiting to see what strength might rise from this cruel humiliation. The flames flickered lower, but Ivy remained in the chair, her shortened hair catching the firelight like a broken halo. Though they had tried to shame her, they had not destroyed her. In the depths of her heart, past the pain and humiliation, a spark of defiance still burned, small but steady as a pilot light, waiting to show the way forward through the dark. The first gray light of dawn crept over the snow-covered peaks, painting long shadows across the valley. Carter Lund guided his horse down the familiar mountain trail, a heavily laden pack horse following behind. Fresh pelts, beaver, fox, and marten, were carefully tied to the pack saddle, the rewards of a week's work in the high country. The morning air bit cold and sharp, but Carter barely noticed through his thick wool coat. As he approached Cold Creek, something felt wrong. The town seemed too quiet, even for early morning. A few people were out, scraping frost from windows or carrying water, but they ducked their heads when they saw him. Carter's neck prickled with unease. Outside the general store, Mr. Peterson was sweeping the boardwalk. The older man's shoulders stiffened when he spotted Carter, and he hurried inside without a word. Through the window, Carter saw him pretending to arrange cans on a shelf, hands trembling. "Morning," Carter called to Mrs. Aberdeen as she crossed the street. The schoolmarm stopped, wringing her hands in her shawl. Her face was drawn with worry. "Mr. Lund," she said, voice quavering. I tried to stop them. I'm so sorry." Before Carter could ask what she meant, she rushed away toward the schoolhouse. His unease deepened. More townspeople appeared in doorways and windows, watching him with guilty eyes before disappearing like prairie dogs spotting a hawk. Carter tied his horses at the hitching post, his movements deliberately slow and controlled. The leather creaked as he loosened the cinch on his saddle. Every sound seemed magnified in the strange stillness, the scrape of his boots on the boardwalk, the jingle of his spurs, the soft whicker of his horse. He spotted Deputy Kersey through the saloon window. The lawman was nursing a morning whiskey, but his usual swagger was missing. When he saw Carter, he quickly looked away. Something had happened. Something bad. Carter's stride lengthened as he left town, heading for home. The 3-mile walk seemed endless. When he finally spotted smoke rising from his cabin's chimney, his chest tightened with relief. At least Ivy was there, was safe. He pushed open the cabin door. "Ivy?" She sat in his chair by the hearth, wearing her best dress despite the early hour. A shawl was wrapped around her head like a turban, though the morning wasn't that cold. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. "Welcome home," she said softly, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Carter crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling beside her chair. "What happened?" His voice was rough with concern. Ivy's hands twisted in her lap. Slowly she unwound the shawl. Carter's breath caught in his throat. Her beautiful golden hair, the hair he loved to run his fingers through, that had hung past her shoulders in a thick braid, was gone. In its place were crude, uneven patches, some places cut nearly to the scalp. It looked like it had been hacked off with a dull knife. "Who did this?" The words came out in a whisper. Ivy told him everything. The miners cornering her, Kersey joining in, the townspeople watching without helping. Her voice stayed steady until she described her long walk home alone through the snow. Then it cracked, just once, before she fell silent. Carter's hands shook as he cupped her face. His thumbs brushed away tears she hadn't realized were falling. Then he pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, breathing in her familiar scent of herbs and wood smoke. Without a word, he stood and walked to the door. The morning air hit him like a physical blow as he stepped outside. The wind had died completely, leaving an eerie stillness. Fresh snow lay unmarked across the yard, pristine as a blank page waiting to be written upon. Carter stood motionless, staring toward town. His jaw was clenched so tight it ached. Inside his chest, rage burned like a banked fire, not the hot flame of sudden anger, but something deeper and more dangerous. This was the cold fury of a mountain winter, patient and implacable as an avalanche waiting to fall. They had hurt his wife, his gentle Ivy, who helped anyone in need without question, who tended the sick and comforted the dying, who saw the best in everyone, even those who deserved it least. They had held her down and cut her hair, not just her hair, but her dignity, her sense of safety in her own town. They had made her walk home alone, crying in the snow, and they had done it where everyone could see. Made it a public spectacle, a message. Carter's hands curled into fists. He knew how to hurt people. His years as an army scout had taught him 100 ways to make men suffer. It would be so easy to give in to that knowledge now, to paint the snow red with vengeance. But that path led somewhere, dark. Somewhere he had promised God and Ivy he would never go again. He forced his fingers to unclench. Violence would only bring more violence. And Ivy deserved better than a husband who solved problems with his fists or his gun. Carter walked to the barn and saddled his fresh horse, his movements precise and controlled. He could feel Ivy watching from the window as he swung into the saddle. He didn't look back, couldn't bear to see her wounded eyes again. The horse's hooves crunched through the crusty snow as he rode toward town. His coat flapped in the still air like a flag of warning. The sound echoed off the mountainsides, announcing his approach long before he came into view. Word of his return spread quickly through Cold Creek. By the time he reached the main street, the boardwalks were deserted. Doors closed. Curtains drew shut. The whole town seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the explosion of violence they all expected. Carter rode past the general store where it had happened, past the saloon where Kersey now hid, past the church where so many had prayed beside his wife. His face was carved from stone, betraying nothing of the storm that raged inside him. He had not yet decided what he would do, but the town's fearful silence told him they knew exactly what they deserved. And sometimes, he reckoned, the waiting was punishment enough. The morning sun climbed higher, glinting off the snow like scattered diamonds. Carter's shadow stretched long and dark across the empty street as he rode, a silent harbinger of judgment to come. The stillness broke as Carter dismounted in the center of Main Street. His boots struck the packed snow with deliberate force. Shopkeepers retreated behind their counters. A group of miners scattered like startled quail, leaving their coffee cups steaming on the cafe table. Even the horses tied to the hitching posts seemed to sense the tension, pawing nervously at the ground. Carter's spurs clinked with each measured step toward the saloon. His shadow fell across the frost-covered windows, dark and sharp as a blade. Inside, he could hear familiar voices, Kersey's distinctive laugh rising above the murmur. The deputy was holding court, probably bragging about yesterday's cruelty over his morning whiskey. The batwing doors creaked as Carter pushed through them. Conversation died. Cards froze mid-deal. A glass stopped halfway to someone's lips. Only Kersey, his back to the door, kept talking. Should have seen her face when that pretty yellow hair hit the ground. Thought she was so much better than us, but... The deputy's words cut off as he noticed the sudden silence. He turned, whiskey glass in hand, and his smirk faltered at the sight of Carter's expressionless face. Carter crossed the room in 4 long strides, his right hand curled into a fist. Before Kersey could set down his drink or reach for his gun, Carter struck. The punch connected with devastating precision, not wild or frenzied, but calculated. The impact lifted Kersey off his feet and dropped him like a felled tree. Glass shattered. Whiskey splashed across the floorboards. The deputy sprawled unconscious, blood trickling from his nose. Someone gasped. A chair scraped back, but Carter was already turning away, leaving Kersey where he lay. He didn't spare a glance for the other men who had helped hurt Ivy. They would keep. This wasn't about vengeance. Not today. Today was about something more important. The saloon doors swung shut behind him. Morning sunlight struck his face, and he blinked at the brightness. That's when he saw her, Ivy, standing in the middle of the street. She must have followed him to town, worried about what he might do. The rough-cut remains of her hair stuck out unevenly from beneath her shawl. Her chin was lifted in that proud way she had, but he could see her trembling. Carter shrugged out of his heavy wool coat as he walked toward her. Without a word, he wrapped it around her shoulders, enveloping her in warmth that still held his body heat. The coat was much too big. She looked like a child playing dress-up, but something in her posture straightened when he draped it over her. "Let's go home," he said softly. Before she could protest, he scooped her into his arms. She weighed hardly anything, like a bird with hollow bones. Her head tucked naturally against his shoulder, and he felt her release a shaky breath. The townspeople lined the boardwalks, watching. Carter met their stares as he carried Ivy down the street. Let them see. Let them remember. Let them understand that this was how a man treated his wife, not with mockery and cruelty, but with tenderness and protection. The 3-mile walk home seemed shorter with Ivy in his arms. She didn't speak, just held onto his shirt with one hand while the other clutched his coat closed at her throat. By the time they reached their cabin, the sun had climbed high enough to start melting the snow from the pine branches. Carter set her gently in her chair by the hearth. He built up the fire, moved the kettle closer to the flames, then gathered what he needed: clean rags, the jar of witch hazel she kept for cuts and bruises, a bowl of warm water. His hands, which had struck with such force an hour ago, were infinitely gentle as he unwrapped her shawl. The damage looked worse in the daylight. They had hacked at her hair with savage carelessness, leaving raw scrapes on her scalp in places. Carter's jaw clenched, but he kept his touch soft as he cleaned each small hurt. "I'm sorry," Ivy whispered. "I know how much you loved my hair." Carter's hands stilled. He moved around to kneel in front of her chair, taking her face between his palms. "You listen to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're still my Ivy. You'll always be my Ivy. Ain't nothing they can do to change that." Tears spilled down her cheeks. He brushed them away with his thumbs, then went back to tending her scalp. By the time he'd finished, her eyelids were drooping with exhaustion. He carried her to their bed, tucked the quilt around her, and sat with her until her breathing deepened into sleep. Only then did Carter allow himself to move. His steps were silent as he crossed to the barn. Inside, his rifle hung on its pegs, the same rifle he'd carried as an army scout that had ended so many lives. His hands remembered its weight as he lifted it down. The familiar motions of loading it were automatic, mindless. 6 shots. 6 men had been involved in hurting Ivy. The math was simple, clean. Justice, frontier style. An eye for an eye, just like the good book said. His finger curled around the trigger guard, but something made him pause. A glint of lamplight on metal caught his eye. There, hanging from a nail on one of the barn's rough-hewn beams, was the small silver crucifix Ivy had put up years ago. She'd hung it the day after they were married, saying the barn needed blessing as much as any church. Carter stared at it for a long moment. The cross seemed to shimmer in the dim light, reminding him of other choices, other paths, of the man he'd been trying to become since he'd met Ivy. Someone who solved problems with wisdom instead of weapons. Someone worthy of her grace. His grip on the rifle loosened. Violence might satisfy the rage burning in his chest, but it wouldn't heal what had been broken. It wouldn't restore Ivy's sense of safety or the town's lost decency. And it surely wouldn't bring him any closer to the Almighty's forgiveness for all the blood already on his hands. The rifle felt heavier now, weighted with choice rather than just steel and wood. Carter stood motionless in the barn's shadows, caught between the man he had been and the man he wanted to be. Between vengeance and mercy. Between the deadly certainty of his trigger finger and the harder path of restraint. The moonlight cast long shadows through the barn's open door as Carter returned the rifle to its pegs. His breath clouded in the cold air while he saddled his horse. The animal sensed his unease, shifting restlessly as he tightened the cinch. "Easy now," he murmured, patting the horse's neck. The touch steadied them both. Snow had started falling again as Carter rode through the sleeping town. Flakes drifted like ash in the darkness, coating his shoulders and the horse's mane. The only light came from a few scattered windows and the dim glow of the church ahead. The little clapboard building stood alone at the edge of town, its weathered cross barely visible against the night sky. Carter had always admired its simplicity. No fancy stained glass or carved doors, just honest wood and faith holding back the wilderness. Now, as he dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, he noticed a faint light flickering through the front window. The wooden steps creaked under his boots. Carter hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the latch. He hadn't set foot in a church since before the Indian Wars. But Ivy's quiet faith had worked its way into him over the years, like water wearing down stone. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Pastor Emmett startled at the sound, nearly dropping the lantern he was carrying. The older man's face paled when he recognized his visitor. Everyone knew Carter Lund's reputation, the silent mountain man who'd killed more men than most had met. "Mr. Lund," the pastor managed, his voice barely steady. I wasn't expecting anyone at this hour." "Didn't mean to frighten you, Pastor." Carter removed his hat, holding it awkwardly. Snow melted from his coat, forming small puddles on the wooden floor. "Need to talk, if you're willing." Emmett nodded slowly, setting the lantern on a nearby pew. Its light threw strange shadows across the walls, making the small church seem larger and more mysterious than it was during Sunday services. Without speaking, Carter moved to the front pew and knelt. The position felt foreign to his body, used to crouching over trap lines and tracking prey. But something in his soul remembered this posture of humility. He bowed his head, searching for words. "They hurt my wife yesterday," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "Cut her hair, shamed her in front of everyone." The pastor's breath caught. He'd heard whispers of what happened, but hadn't witnessed it himself. Shame colored his face as he realized his own cowardice in not seeking out the Lunds sooner. "I know who did it," Carter continued. "Could name every man. Could—" He paused, his hands tightening on his hat brim. "Could make them pay. But that ain't why I'm here." Emmett moved closer, drawn by the raw honesty in Carter's voice. "Why are you here, then?" Carter lifted his head, meeting the pastor's gaze. "I'm here because I need help forgiving them." The words hung in the air between them. Emmett stared at the kneeling man, trying to reconcile this request with everything he'd heard about Carter Lund. The fearsome tracker. The deadly shot. The man who'd once killed 3 claim jumpers without breaking a sweat. "Forgiveness," Emmett repeated, uncertainty clear in his voice. "Are you certain that's what you're seeking?" "Ain't certain of nothing, Pastor." Carter's shoulders slumped slightly. "Except that more violence won't heal what's broken. Won't help Ivy. Won't help this town." He gestured at the cross hanging behind the altar. "Reckon if he could forgive those who killed him, I ought to at least try forgiving those who hurt my wife." Emmett sank onto the pew, overwhelmed by the mountain man's unexpected spiritual depth. Was this genuine faith or some kind of madness born of grief? He'd seen men broken by the frontier before, their minds twisted by isolation and hardship. But there was something in Carter's demeanor, a quiet certainty beneath the obvious struggle, that spoke of authentic transformation. The pastor remembered his own battlefield days, how he'd counseled dying soldiers toward forgiveness rather than hatred. Perhaps this was no different. "It won't be easy," Emmett said finally. "Forgiveness rarely is, but if you're truly seeking this path..." He straightened, finding his pastoral voice. "I'll help however I can." They talked through the night, their low voices echoing in the empty church. Carter spoke of his years as an army scout, of the weight of so many deaths on his conscience. He described meeting Ivy, how her gentle strength had shown him a different way of living, and he confessed his burning desire for revenge, the temptation still calling to him like a fever in his blood. Emmett listened, offering scripture when needed, but mostly just bearing witness to this warrior's struggle toward grace. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they prayed together, the pastor's formal words mixing with Carter's rougher but equally sincere petitions. Before leaving, Carter asked one final thing. "Would you tell folks about what we discussed? Might help them understand." Emmett nodded, recognizing the wisdom in this request. "I'll spread the word that you came seeking forgiveness instead of vengeance. It might shame some into examining their own hearts." The sun was just cresting the mountains when Carter rode home through the deepening snow. The storm had strengthened, wind whipping ice crystals against his face. But inside, he felt strangely peaceful, as if some great burden had begun to lift. He found Ivy awake in their cabin, stoking the morning fire. She'd wrapped her shawl carefully around her shorn head, but her eyes were clearer than yesterday. The sight of her quiet dignity made his heart ache with love. "You were gone a while," she said softly, not asking where he'd been. Carter hung his snow-covered coat by the door. "Needed to sort some things out." He crossed to help her with the coffee pot she was settling over the flames. Had a long talk with Pastor Emmett. Understanding flickered across her face. She knew him well enough to guess what kind of struggle he'd been fighting. Without speaking, she began preparing their breakfast, cornbread, and the last of the preserved peaches. The familiar routine felt like a blessing, a reminder that some things remained unchanged despite yesterday's cruelty. They ate in comfortable silence while the storm raged outside. Wind rattled the window panes and snow hissed against the logs. But inside their cabin, the fire crackled steadily, and coffee steam curled up from their cups like prayer. Carter watched his wife, marveling at her strength. Even with her beauty attacked, her dignity assaulted, she carried herself with grace. Her hands were steady as she broke the cornbread. Her presence filled their home with peace he didn't deserve, but desperately needed. The storm built around their cabin, but they remained wrapped in that quiet moment of shared understanding. No words were needed between them. They had weathered harder trials than this. Drought, fever, loss. They would weather this too, not through violence, but through something stronger. Forgiveness freely chosen, love stubbornly maintained in the face of hatred. 2 days after Carter's nighttime visit to the church, the bell's clear tone rang out across Cold Creek. The sound carried through the crisp morning air, drawing townsfolk from their homes and businesses. This wasn't the usual Sunday call to worship. Pastor Emmett had announced a special meeting of conscience. The streets filled with murmuring people, their breath visible in the cold. Outside the general store, 3 miners huddled together, passing a flask. "Reckon the mountain man's gone soft in the head," one muttered. "All this talk of forgiveness." "Might be a trick," another suggested. "Get us all in one place, then." He drew a finger across his throat, but others weren't so quick to judge. Sarah Emmett, the pastor's wife, overheard them as she passed. "That man spent all night on his knees praying," she said firmly. "Show some respect." The crowd parted as Ivy appeared, walking slowly down the street. She'd left her shawl loose around her shoulders, exposing her brutally shorn head to the morning light. The sight made some turn away in shame. Others stared openly, especially the children, who had never seen a grown woman without hair. But Ivy met their gazes with gentle smiles, nodding to those she knew. When little Mary Thompson pointed and asked her mother why the lady was bald, Ivy knelt down and spoke softly to the child. "Sometimes people do unkind things," she explained, her voice carrying in the hushed street. "But that doesn't mean we have to be unkind back." The girl's mother flushed red and hurried her away, but the moment lingered. Several women wiped tears from their eyes, remembering how Ivy had helped tend their sick children or shared her healing herbs without asking payment. Inside the church, the wooden pews filled quickly. Carter sat in the front row, his broad shoulders straight but not tense. Ivy settled beside him, her presence like a calm pool in troubled waters. Pastor Emmett stood at the pulpit, fingers nervously adjusting his Bible. The door creaked open one last time as Deputy Kersey swaggered in. His face still showed the purple bruise from Carter's punch, and he made sure everyone saw the badge pinned to his chest. He chose a seat near the back, boots propped irreverently on the pew in front of him. "Brothers and sisters," Pastor Emmett began, his voice trembling slightly. "We're gathered here because something broke in our community this week. Not just rules or laws, but the bonds of basic human dignity." He paused, gathering courage. "When I came to Cold Creek, I promised to serve God by serving you all. But I failed in that duty when I stayed silent in the face of cruelty." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. The pastor rarely admitted personal fault. "But today," he continued, "we have a chance to heal. Mr. Lund has asked to speak." The church fell silent as Carter rose. He wasn't a tall man, but something about his presence filled the space. Everyone knew his reputation, the deadly accuracy with a rifle, the swift justice he'd dealt to outlaws. But now he stood before them unarmed, his calloused hands empty at his sides. "Ain't much for speeches," he began softly, his voice rough but clear. "Spent most of my life in the high country, where a man's word and actions matter more than fancy talk." He glanced at Ivy, drawing strength from her slight nod. 2 days ago, I wanted blood." The brutal honesty made several people shift uncomfortably. "Wanted to make those responsible suffer worse than they made my wife suffer. Would have been easy. Right, even, by some ways of thinking." Deputy Kersey snorted from the back, but Carter continued as if he hadn't heard. "But I've seen where that path leads, seen how violence breeds violence until there's nothing left but graves and grieving." He turned slowly, meeting eyes across the congregation. "No man stronger than the mercy he refuses. Took me most of my life to learn that." A sob broke the silence. Mrs. Peterson, one of the women who'd watched Ivy's humiliation without intervening, pressed her handkerchief to her face. Her husband wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his own eyes wet. "I'm asking for something harder than justice," Carter said, "asking for us all to choose mercy, to remember we're neighbors before we're enemies." More people were crying now. The miller's wife slipped out of her pew and crossed to Ivy, pressing something into her hands, a beautiful knitted shawl. Others followed, offering small gestures of apology and support. But not everyone was moved. Several men stood and walked out, their boot heels striking the wooden floor like judgment. Deputy Kersey remained seated, his face twisted in a sneer. Pastor Emmett returned to the pulpit, his voice stronger now. "Peace isn't just the absence of violence," he declared. "It's the presence of justice and mercy together. We can't undo what was done, but we can choose a better path forward." He raised his hands in blessing, but before he could speak, Kersey's voice cut through the air like a whip. "This is foolishness," the deputy spat. "Man lets his wife get shamed, then comes preaching forgiveness instead of defending her proper? Where I come from, that's called cowardice." The words hung in the air like smoke. Carter didn't turn around, but his shoulders tightened. Ivy reached for his hand, her touch anchoring him. "Maybe," Carter replied quietly, still facing forward. "You ought to think about why you need others to be violent to feel strong yourself." The deputy's face darkened, but he said nothing more. He pushed himself up and stalked out, leaving the door swinging behind him. The meeting ended in uneasy silence. People filed out slowly, some stopping to speak softly with Carter and Ivy, others hurrying past with averted eyes. The transformation wasn't complete. Cold Creek had too many old wounds, too much pride for instant healing. But something had shifted. Sarah Emmett watched from the church steps as Ivy walked home, surrounded by a small group of women offering support and companionship. Where days ago there had been mockery, now there was respect. The schoolteacher smiled, recognizing how Ivy's quiet dignity had accomplished what no amount of threats could have done. It had begun to melt frozen hearts. But her smile faded as she noticed Deputy Kersey watching from the saloon porch, his face dark with unconcealed malice. His arrogance had been challenged, his authority questioned. Sarah shivered, knowing that men like him didn't accept such blows to their pride lightly. The church bell tolled once more, a final note fading into the morning air. The sound seemed to hang between the promise of peace and the shadow of violence still to come. The morning frost painted delicate patterns on the cabin windows as Ivy prepared her medicine basket. Steam rose from jars of pine needle tea and elderberry syrup, filling the small room with their healing scent. She wrapped warm cloths around the glass containers, knowing how precious warmth would be in the drafty miners' shacks. Carter watched from his chair by the fire, whittling a small wooden horse. "You sure about this?" he asked softly. "Some of those same folks." "Sickness doesn't care who was kind or cruel," Ivy answered, settling her shawl around her shoulders. Her hair had begun to grow back, a soft, dark fuzz that caught the early light. "Besides, those children need help." The influenza had swept through Cold Creek like a prairie fire, striking the poorest families hardest. In the cramped mining quarters, fever spread quick as gossip. Ivy had heard the coughing from the church steps 3 days ago and knew what was coming. She made her first stop at the Murphys' shack, where 3 children huddled on a single straw mattress, their faces flushed with fever. Their mother, Sarah, who'd turned away when Ivy was shamed in the street, now wept with gratitude as Ivy showed her how to make the healing tea. "I can't pay," Sarah whispered, her own voice hoarse. We ain't got nothing extra since Tom hurt his back in the mine." Ivy squeezed her hand. "The good Lord doesn't charge for sunshine or rain," she said simply. "Neither do I." House by house, she moved through the miners' quarter. Some faces still turned away in shame, but more and more welcomed her. Children especially brightened at her approach. She always carried hard candy in her pocket, a sweet reward for taking bitter medicine. Meanwhile, Carter loaded his axe and saw into his wagon. Winter had been hard on the widow's woodpiles, and he'd noticed Mrs. Peterson's stack running low. She was one who'd stood silent during Ivy's humiliation, but her husband had died in a mine collapse last fall, leaving her with 4 young ones to feed. The morning air rang with the steady rhythm of his chopping. Some folks stopped to stare. The fearsome mountain man, doing common labor for those who'd wronged his wife. But Carter just worked steadily, splitting log after log into neat stacks. When Mrs. Peterson tried to offer him eggs in payment, he shook his head. "Just being neighborly," he said quietly. "Way folks ought to be." By midday, word had spread through town about the Lund's acts of kindness. The schoolmarm watched from her window as Carter unloaded wood at another widow's home, and she wasn't the only one. Eyes that had once held fear or scorn now showed something different, respect, and maybe a touch of shame. "Never seen nothing like it," old Jim at the general store told his customers. "Them two are either saints or touched in the head, after what was done." But even as the town's heart began to thaw, darker currents stirred beneath the surface. In the saloon, Deputy Kersey held court with 2 well-dressed strangers, railroad men from Denver, their boots still dusty from the stage. "That mountain land's perfect for the spur line," one said, studying a map spread across the bar. "Natural grade, good water access, companies willing to pay fair price?" Kersey's bruise had faded to yellow, but his pride still stung. "Might be some question about their claim to it," he said carefully. "Territorial Records Office can be mighty particular about paperwork." The railroad men exchanged knowing looks. Money changed hands under the table, and Kersey's smile grew sharp as a coyote's. That evening, Ivy and Carter sat together by their fireplace, tired but content from their day's work. She was showing him how to roll bandages when they heard hoofbeats approaching. The stage was late today, fighting through spring mud. A knock at the door made them both start. Carter opened it to find young Tommy from the telegraph office, holding an official-looking envelope. "Express letter from Denver, Mr. Lund," the boy said breathlessly. "Marked urgent." Carter thanked him with a coin and brought the letter to the lamp. His hands were steady as he broke the seal, but Ivy saw the tension in his shoulders as he read. "It's from some fancy law firm," he said finally. "Says there's irregularities in our land title. Claims we never properly registered the mineral rights when we filed the homestead claim." Ivy moved closer, reading over his shoulder. The language was dense with legal terms, but the threat was clear enough. Without proper registration, they could lose everything. The cabin, the trap lines, the sweet spring water, all of it. "This isn't right," she said softly. "We filed everything proper when we married. I remember because Pastor Emmett helped us with the papers." Carter nodded slowly. "Reckon some folks aim to test our newfound faith in mercy," he said. His voice was quiet, but she heard the steel beneath it. Ivy felt cold despite the fire's warmth. She'd seen how the railroad companies worked in other towns, finding legal tricks to force people off their land, offering prices too low to start fresh elsewhere. And with Kersey helping them... "It's a trap," she whispered, gripping Carter's rough hand. "They think you'll fight back with violence, give them excuse to arrest you. Then the land would be even easier to take." Carter was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. The letter trembled slightly in his other hand, not from fear, but from the effort of containing his anger. "Time was, I'd have ridden straight to town and settled this with lead," he said finally. "Part of me still wants to." Ivy squeezed his hand tighter. "I know, but that's what they're counting on." Carter turned to her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "What do we do then, love? How do we fight this kind of battle?" Instead of answering immediately, Ivy knelt beside him. Her voice was soft but certain as she began to pray, asking for guidance, for strength to face this new test with the same grace they'd shown before. Carter's grip on her hand steadied as they prayed together. The lamplight cast their shadow on the cabin wall, two figures bowed in faith, yet unbroken by the schemes of men. Outside, an owl called in the darkness. The letter lay forgotten on the table, its threats powerless against the stronger bonds of love and trust that filled the small cabin. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now, they found peace in each other's presence and the quiet strength of their shared prayer. The evening grew later, but they remained by the fire, planning their response with the same careful wisdom that had transformed their tragedy into healing for the whole town. This new challenge would test them differently, not their capacity for forgiveness, but their endurance in the face of greed and corruption. Yet as Ivy looked at her husband's weathered face, peaceful. Despite the threat hanging over them, she felt a surge of hope. They had already chosen a harder path than violence, and it had begun to bear fruit. Somehow they would find a way through this test as well, holding to their faith and to each other. The morning frost crackled under Carter's boots as he readied his horse for the journey. 2 days' hard riding to the courthouse in Silver Junction lay ahead, with winter's grip still tight on the mountain passes. Ivy stood wrapped in his old coat, watching him check the cinch straps one final time. "You sure you won't stay with Sarah while I'm gone?" Carter asked, his breath clouding in the dawn air. Ivy shook her head. "Sarah Emmett needs help with her quilting circle. I'll stay in town with her." She touched his arm. "Besides, folks need to see we ain't afraid." Carter nodded, understanding her quiet strength. The pastor's wife had offered their spare room the moment she heard of Carter's journey, refusing to hear any protest. It was safer than Ivy staying alone at their cabin, especially with Kersey's threats hanging in the air. 2 days there, 2 days back, Carter said, swinging into the saddle. "Any longer, you send word up the stage line." Ivy pressed a package of jerky and cornbread into his saddlebag. "The Lord will watch over you," she said softly. "Remember what Pastor Emmett said about patience." Carter touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that carried more meaning than words between them. Then he turned his horse toward the trail, the animal's hooves cutting fresh tracks in the morning snow. The first day's ride tested both man and beast. The path wound through narrow passes where drifts had built up shoulder high. Carter led his horse on foot through the worst spots, the wind cutting through his wool coat like knives. By midday, his beard was heavy with ice. Near sunset, he reached Broken Creek, usually an easy ford this time of year. But spring thaw had begun in the high country, and the water ran swift and dark between sheets of ice. Carter spent an hour searching for a safe crossing, finally finding a place where ice bridges had formed strong enough to bear weight. He made camp that night in a stand of pines, sharing his jerky with the horse. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and cold, as he thought about Ivy back in town. The memory of her shorn head still made his hands shake with anger. But she'd shown him a different kind of strength, one that didn't need a gun to prove itself. Dawn found him already in the saddle, pushing hard through the second day. The courthouse town appeared by mid-afternoon, a cluster of brick buildings and painted storefronts trying to look more civilized than the wilderness around it. Carter tied his horse at the public trough and climbed the courthouse steps, his boots leaving muddy prints on the polished wood. The clerk's office smelled of dust and paper. A young man in a striped vest barely looked up from his ledger as Carter approached. "Land Title Office?" Carter asked, keeping his voice level. The clerk pointed toward a door marked Property Records without speaking. Carter found himself in a smaller room where an older man with ink-stained fingers sat behind a desk piled with documents. "Need to check a homestead claim," Carter said. "Lund Property, Cold Creek District." The clerk's expression shifted slightly, too slightly to be natural. "Ah, yes, the Lund tract. Let me see here." He made a show of searching through files. Carter's patience thinned as he watched the man shuffle papers. Something wasn't right. "Here we are," the clerk said finally. "I'm afraid there's been a change in status. The mineral rights were sold to the Denver and Western Railroad Company last month. Signed and registered by..." He adjusted his spectacles. "Deputy Marshal Walter Kersey, acting as territory agent." The room seemed to darken at the edges of Carter's vision. His right hand twitched toward his gun belt. "That's fraud," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Kersey has no authority over our claim." The clerk's smile turned oily. "The paperwork appears to be in order. If you wish to dispute it, you'll need to file a formal challenge. Takes months to process, of course, and the fees are substantial." Carter's fingers brushed his revolver's grip. One quick motion would wipe that smirk away forever. The old violence rose in him like a tide, familiar and tempting. But then he heard Pastor Emmett's words from that night in the church. "The hardest victory isn't over other men, but over the darkness in our own hearts." His hand fell away from the gun. The clerk's smile faltered slightly, sensing how close he'd come to death. "I'll be back," Carter said simply. "With lawyers." The ride home seemed longer, the cold deeper. Carter let his horse pick its own pace through the gathering dark, his mind wrestling with what he'd learned. Kersey had finally shown his hand, using the law itself as a weapon, twisting it to serve the railroad's greed. Night had fallen by the time he reached Cold Creek. A single lantern burned in the pastor's house window, and as he dismounted stiffly, the door opened. Ivy stood in the lamplight, her face showing relief at his return. She helped him stable his horse, neither speaking until they were inside. Sarah Emmett had left a pot of beans warming on the stove, and Ivy cut thick slices of fresh cornbread while Carter thawed by the fire. Finally, over the simple meal, Carter told her what he'd found. Ivy listened without interrupting, her face growing grave. "So that's their game," she said when he finished. "Use Kersey's badge to make it look legal." Carter nodded, pushing his empty plate away. "The clerk's in on it too, probably half the courthouse." He ran a hand over his face, exhausted. "We could lose everything, Ivy. The cabin, the trap lines, all of it." Ivy reached across the table and took his rough hand in hers. "We still have what matters most," she said softly. "Our faith, each other, the truth." Carter squeezed her fingers gently, marveling at her quiet strength. The rage that had nearly consumed him at the courthouse seemed smaller now, like a candle next to the sun. They sat together in comfortable silence, the kitchen warm and peaceful around them. Outside, snow began falling again, but here, in this moment, they found shelter in each other's presence. The fight wasn't over, it was only beginning. But they would face it together, with the same grace that had already begun healing their town's wounded heart. Sarah Emmett's quilts lay stacked nearby, evidence of the work that had kept Ivy's hands busy during his absence. Simple things, Carter thought. Cloth and thread, cornbread and beans, a lantern in the window. Yet somehow they formed a stronger barrier against evil than any gun could provide. The midnight hour found them still at the table, planning their next steps with careful wisdom. The railroad scheme had been revealed, but exposing it would take more than accusations. They would need proof, witnesses, and most of all, patience. Carter watched his wife's face in the lamplight, seeing the same determination that had carried her through public shame now turned toward this new challenge. Whatever came next, they would face it with the strength they'd found in Mercy's path. The town hall stood silent as a church, packed with bodies but devoid of sound. Morning light filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Pastor Emmett had called this meeting to address the mounting tension over land claims, but no one expected what was about to unfold. Ivy sat beside Carter in the back row, her shawl drawn close. Though her hair had begun to grow back in wispy patches, she still felt the lingering stares. The room smelled of wood smoke and damp wool. Dozens of townspeople crowded shoulder to shoulder in the narrow benches. Deputy Kersey lounged near the front, boots propped on an empty chair, his badge catching the light each time he shifted. Two railroad men in dark suits flanked him, their Denver-bought clothes standing out among the worn jackets and patched dresses of Cold Creek's residents. "Friends and neighbors," Pastor Emmett began, his voice steady despite the tension. "We've gathered to discuss the recent property disputes affecting our community. Several homesteaders have reported irregularities in their land titles." "All perfectly legal," one of the railroad men interrupted, rising smoothly. "The Denver and Western Railroad Company has obtained clear rights to—" A soft voice cut through his words, speaking in a language few there understood. Heads turned as Asha, the Ute midwife, stood from her place near the wall. She wore a simple dress of frontier cotton, her black hair braided traditionally, her presence commanding attention without seeking it. The railroad man faltered. "I don't believe this is an appropriate—" "Let her speak." Ivy's clear voice carried from the back. "Samuel Turner can translate. He trades with the Ute often enough." Deputy Kersey's boots hit the floor with a thud. "This ain't no place for—" "Let her speak," Carter echoed, and something in his tone made Kersey sink back into his chair. Samuel Turner, a weathered man with kind eyes, moved to stand beside Asha. She began speaking again, her words flowing like water over stones, and Turner translated carefully. "3 winters ago," he interpreted, "men wearing badges like his—" Asha pointed at Kersey's chest. "Came to our settlement. They spoke of papers and laws, but their real speech was with money. Silver dollars that bought false documents, that turned our hunting grounds into railroad land." The room stirred uneasily. Asha continued, her dignity undimmed by the hostile stares of some listeners. "We saw them meet in secret with others who wore no badges. They drew lines on maps, passed bags of coins, wrote their lying words. When our leaders protested, they threatened worse than papers. My husband died defending our claim." Her voice remained steady, though her hands tightened on her shawl. "Now I see the same men using the same methods against you." Kersey surged to his feet. "This is slander. You can't trust the word of—" "I trust her word more than yours, deputy." The schoolmarm, Miss Agnes Wheeler, stood trembling but determined. "I saw you myself, meeting those men behind the livery stable last month, counting money in the dark." A murmur ran through the crowd. Others began to nod, pieces falling into place. "The Stevens family lost their creek claim the same way," someone called out, "right after Kersey visited with those papers. And the Wilsons' grazing land—" "Enough!" Kersey's face had turned red. "This is nothing but lies and savage talk. My wife ain't no liar." Carter's quiet words fell like stones into still water. And neither is Asha. She's known in this town for her healing work, same as Ivy. When fever took half our children 2 summers back, she helped nurse them, asking nothing in return. Ivy rose slowly, moving to stand beside Asha. The 2 women faced the crowd together, one tall and fair, one shorter and darker, both carrying the same unwavering strength. "Asha saved my baby's life," Sarah Emmett spoke up from her seat near the pulpit. "When complications came during birthing, she knew things our own doctor didn't. I reckon that makes her word as good as any man's in this room." The railroad men exchanged glances, their confidence visibly shaken. One began gathering his papers with careful movements, like a man backing away from a wild animal. Kersey's hand strayed toward his gun, but a dozen hostile stares made him think better of it. "You're all fools," he spat. "The railroad's coming whether you like it or not. Progress don't wait for—" "Progress built on theft ain't progress at all," Pastor Emmett said quietly. "It's just greed wearing a cleaner coat." People were standing now, moving to surround Ivy and Asha. The school marm, the blacksmith and his wife, 3 farmers whose lands bordered Carter's claim. Even old Mrs. Henderson, who hadn't spoken to Ivy since the day of her shame, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "I was wrong," the elderly woman said softly. "Wrong to stay quiet then, wrong to doubt now. Whatever you need to fight this, count me in." Kersey looked around the room, seeing his power crumbling like sand. With a curse, he shoved his way toward the door, the railroad men close behind. "This ain't over," he snarled from the threshold. "You'll all regret crossing me, and you—" He jabbed a finger toward Asha. "You'll learn to keep your place." Then he was gone, boot heels ringing on the boardwalk outside. The door slammed behind him, leaving a moment of ringing silence. It was broken by Samuel Turner's quiet voice. "Reckon we ought to form a committee," he said practically. "Get all these stories written down proper, send them to the territorial governor. Man I know in Denver says he's been looking for proof of railroad corruption." As people gathered, Turner beginning to plan, Ivy turned to Asha. No words passed between them. None were needed. Their hands clasped in a grip of shared understanding, of dignity recognized and courage honored. Outside, the first heavy flakes of snow began to fall. They gathered quickly on the windowsills, thick and white as wool. Several people glanced up at the darkening sky with worried expressions. "Storm's coming," Carter observed, moving to stand beside his wife. "Bad one, by the look of those clouds." Ivy nodded, still holding Asha's hand. "Let it come," she said quietly. "We've weathered worse." The lanterns were lit early that day, their warm glow spilling from windows up and down the street as people hurried to prepare for the coming storm. But inside the town hall, no one seemed eager to leave. They gathered in small groups, voices low but determined, sharing stories they'd kept silent too long. The truth, once spoken, seemed to take on a life of its own. Like a spring flood breaking winter ice, it swept away the barriers of fear and prejudice that had divided them. Settler and Ute, farmer and townsfolk, they found common ground in their shared struggle against corruption. As the snow fell heavier outside, Asha finally prepared to leave. Her settlement was an hour's ride away, and she needed to start home before the trail became dangerous. But she paused in the doorway, looking back at the gathering with quiet satisfaction. "My people have a saying," she told Ivy through Samuel Turner's translation. "Truth is like a mountain stream. It may be dammed for a while, but it will always find its way to the valley." Ivy squeezed her friend's hand one last time. "God keep you safe on the trail," she said softly. "And thank you for everything." The heavy snow continued to fall as Asha rode away, her figure growing indistinct in the thickening white curtain. Inside the town hall, lanterns burned bright against the gathering dark, illuminating faces now united in purpose, where once they had been divided by fear and suspicion. The first real allies had emerged from this meeting, not just against Kersey and the railroad, but for something larger, something that spoke of healing old wounds and building new trust. As the storm settled in around them, they continued their work, writing down testimonies and forming plans, their voices mixing together in the warm lamplight like family gathered around a hearth. The morning after Asha's testimony, Pastor Emmett sat at his desk, sheets of paper spread before him in the pale dawn light. His normally steady hands shook slightly as he dipped his pen, beginning yet another letter to the territorial governor. Sarah, his wife, placed a steaming cup of coffee at his elbow. "That's your third letter this morning," she observed quietly. "Each one carries a different account," he replied, not looking up. "The Wilsons' grazing land, the Stevens family's creek, the Morgan widow's timber claim, all lost to Kersey's. Schemes!" The pastor's small study filled with scratching sounds as his pen moved across paper. Outside, Cold Creek was waking up. Wagon wheels creaked through morning frost. The general store's bell chimed as early customers arrived. But the usual chatter was subdued, replaced by purpose. At the sheriff's office, Samuel Turner and 3 other men were carefully copying documents, comparing dates and names. They worked in silence, marking suspicious patterns in Kersey's land dealings. The deputy's desk stood empty. He hadn't been seen since storming out of the meeting 2 days before. "Look here," Turner said suddenly, holding up a deed. "This signature, it's dated 3 months after old Jim Stevens passed. Dead men don't sign papers." The others gathered round, faces grim. Another piece of evidence for their growing collection. Up the mountain, Carter and Ivy's cabin had become a sanctuary of sorts. Each evening, people gathered there to pray. Tonight was no different. As darkness fell, lanterns bobbed up the trail like fireflies. Miners still dusty from their shifts, farmers with calloused hands, women carrying covered dishes, even a few Ute families from the settlement, led by Asha. Ivy welcomed them all, her uncovered head held high. What had been meant as shame had transformed into something else entirely. The miners who had once jeered now removed their hats in her presence, seeing in her shorn head a symbol of dignity, unbroken. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Pastor Emmett had said earlier that week. "Sometimes our deepest wounds become our greatest testimony." Inside the warm cabin, voices raised in prayer mixed with the crackle of the hearth. Carter stood quietly by the door, watching his wife move among their guests. She poured coffee, touched shoulders, spoke soft words of encouragement. Her strength seemed to flow outward, touching everyone around her. When Sunday came, the little church could barely contain the crowd. People who hadn't attended service in years found themselves drawn to the wooden pews. Rough-handed miners knelt awkwardly, remembering prayers from childhood. A Ute family sat in the back row, Asha among them, listening intently as Samuel Turner translated the sermon. Pastor Emmett's voice grew stronger with each word. "Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. But I say unto you, greater strength hath no man than this, that he lay down his pride and choose mercy over vengeance." Carter and Ivy sat in their usual place, hands clasped. The morning light through the windows caught the silver threads in his beard, the smooth curve of her bare head. Together they embodied the sermon's message: love that endured shame, strength that chose forgiveness. But darkness gathered at the edges of their hard-won peace. Reports trickled in of strangers in town, hard-faced men with well-oiled guns. They lingered in the saloon, watching, waiting. Kersey had been seen with them, his badge now more threat than protection. One evening, as the prayer meeting dispersed, Asha pulled Carter aside. Her face was tight with worry as Turner translated her warning. 2 nights ago, our hunter saw Kersey near the railroad camp. He spoke with men there, showed them maps. They carried many weapons. Carter nodded slowly. Much obliged for the warning, sister. After the others left, he took down his rifle. The familiar weight felt different now, not an instrument of vengeance, but a tool of protection. As he cleaned it by lamplight, Ivy sat beside him, her fingers steady as she loaded cartridges into his belt. I won't start trouble, he said quietly, but if trouble comes to our people... I know. She touched his arm. This isn't about pride or revenge anymore. It's about protecting what's right. The next day, more strangers arrived. They set up camp near the railroad survey markers, just within sight of town. Their campfires at night were like malevolent eyes watching Cold Creek. People began locking their doors earlier. The street grew quiet after sunset. Yet hope continued to bloom, fragile but persistent as early spring flowers. The church bell rang each morning for prayer. Asha's people shared healing knowledge with town women. Children who had once thrown stones now played together, learning each other's games. In the general store, Mrs. Henderson watched a Ute mother examining fabric. Without hesitation, she stepped forward to help, showing her the best prices. Their hands touched over bright calico, and both women smiled. The schoolhouse filled with new faces, Ute children beside settler children, learning together. Miss Wheeler taught them all, her gentle voice carrying through the open windows as she explained numbers and letters. Each small act of kindness, each bridge built between former strangers, felt like a victory over the hatred Kersey represented. But they all knew the deputy wouldn't go quietly. His power was built on division and fear. Their unity was a direct threat. Carter took to patrolling at night, his rifle ready but never aimed. Other men joined him, settlers and Ute warriors riding together, watching over their shared community. They moved like shadows through the darkness, alert for trouble. One night, returning from patrol, Carter found Ivy still awake. She sat by the fire, mending his coat, her face peaceful in the flickering light. You should sleep, he said softly. I sleep better knowing you're watching over us all. She set aside her sewing. Pastor Emmett received word from Denver today. The governor's office is sending investigators. Carter hung his rifle carefully on its pegs. That's good news, but it makes Kersey more dangerous. A cornered wolf bites hardest. Then we'll face him together. Ivy stood, touching his weathered cheek. All of us, the whole town. Outside their window, snow began falling again. The thick flakes caught the lamplight, glowing like embers against the dark. In town, other windows still shone. People staying up late, copying documents, writing testimonies, preparing for whatever came next. The night wrapped around Cold Creek like a blanket, broken only by the gleam of campfires from the railroad camp. In the shadows between light and darkness, hope and danger danced their delicate balance. But within the circle of lamplight, Carter and Ivy held each other, their faith steady as the mountain itself. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For now they had this moment of peace, wrapped in the quiet of falling snow and shared purpose. Their prayers rose silent and strong, not for victory but for wisdom, not for vengeance but for justice. The rifle hung on its pegs, necessary but not central. Their real strength lay in the bonds they'd built, in the community that had grown from soil once poisoned by hatred. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Settler and Ute, farmer and miner, all united in the cause of truth. The night lay deep and silent over Cold Creek, broken only by the soft whisper of snow falling through bare branches. In their cabin, Carter and Ivy slept peacefully, his arm draped protectively over her shoulders. The fire had burned low to glowing embers, casting faint shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The church bell's first wild peal shattered the stillness like a gunshot. Carter bolted upright, instantly alert. Beside him, Ivy gasped awake as the frantic tolling continued. Through their frosted window, an orange glow painted the sky above the town. "Fire!" the cry echoed up the mountainside, carried by the winter wind. Carter was already pulling on his boots, his movements swift and sure. Ivy rushed to help him with his heavy coat, her fingers trembling but determined. The bell kept ringing, desperate and irregular, a sound of pure terror. "The church!" Ivy whispered, pressing her face against the glass. "Oh, Lord, it's the church!" Without waiting for a saddle, Carter ran to the barn. His stallion nickered nervously at the commotion. Carter grabbed only a blanket, throwing it over the horse's back before swinging up. The cold bit through his clothes as he urged the horse down the snowy trail, Ivy's prayers following him into the darkness. The scene that greeted him in town was chaos. Flames roared from the church's wooden walls, reaching hungry fingers toward the star-filled sky. Heat blasted his face as he reined up, watching townsfolk running with buckets and shouting in panic. The snow around the building had melted into slick mud, making every step treacherous. Samuel Turner grabbed Carter's arm as he dismounted. "Pastor Emmett's trapped inside." The translator's face was streaked with soot. "He was working late on tomorrow's sermon, and Asha's boy, Little Bear, he was helping clean." Carter's heart clenched. Through the smoke, he could see Asha being held back by other women, her screams rising above the crackle of flames. My son is in there." The bucket line was failing, too little water against too much fire. The church's roof was already beginning to cave, sending showers of sparks into the night sky. Without hesitation, Carter stripped off his heavy coat and wrapped it around his head and shoulders, leaving only his eyes exposed. "Carter, no!" someone shouted, but he was already moving. The heat hit him like a wall as he shouldered through the burning door. Smoke filled his lungs immediately, making him stagger. The interior was an inferno, pews ablaze, hymn books curling into ash, the cross above the altar wreathed in flames. "Pastor!" he shouted, choking on the thick air. "Little Bear!" A weak cough answered from near the pulpit. Through the smoke, Carter saw Pastor Emmett sprawled on the floor, Little Bear's small form clutched protectively in his arms. They must have tried to reach the back door and been overcome. The roof groaned ominously above them. Carter lunged forward, scooping up the boy first. "Can you walk?" he asked the pastor, extending his free hand. Emmett nodded weakly, grabbing Carter's arm. Together they staggered toward the door as burning timbers crashed behind them. The smoke was blinding now, the heat unbearable. Carter's lungs screamed for clean air. His coat began to smolder despite the wet blanket he'd wrapped around it. Just when he thought they wouldn't make it, cold air hit his face. They burst through the doorway in a shower of sparks, all three collapsing into the blessed snow. Cheers and cries of relief erupted from the crowd. Asha ran forward, gathering her son into her arms with sob of joy. The boy was conscious but dazed, coughing heavily. Pastor Emmett lay gasping in the snow, his face blackened with soot but alive. Sarah Emmett fell to her knees beside her husband, tears streaming down her face as she checked him for serious injuries. Carter tried to stand, but found he couldn't. The world spun dizzyingly around him as smoke-filled lungs fought for air. His hands and neck stung fiercely where the flames had touched him. Through blurry eyes, he saw Ivy running toward him through the crowd. "Carter." She reached him just as he slumped fully into the snow. Her cool hands touched his face, bringing blessed relief. "Someone fetch Dr. Matthews." The church continued to burn behind them, but no one paid it any mind now. All attention was on the 3 survivors. More blankets appeared, along with water and soothing hands. Carter felt himself being lifted, carried somewhere warmer. Ivy's voice stayed close, murmuring prayers of thanksgiving. They took them all to the hotel, the closest building with enough room. Dr. Matthews arrived quickly, his bag clutched in his gnarled hands. He treated the burns and smoke damage with gentle efficiency, applying salve and bandages where needed. "You'll all live," he announced gruffly, though his eyes were suspiciously bright. But it was a near thing, a very near thing indeed. Little Bear recovered fastest, as children often do. Soon he was sitting up in bed, holding his mother's hand while she spoke soft words in their native tongue. The pastor's voice would be rough for weeks, but he too would heal completely. Carter suffered the worst burns, having stayed in the fire longest, but even those were superficial, painful, but not life-threatening. Through it all, Ivy never left his side. She helped change his bandages, spooned water between his cracked lips, and sang hymns softly when the pain kept him from sleeping. Her touch was gentle on his burned skin, her voice steady with faith that had been tested but never broken. As dawn approached, Sheriff Mills confirmed what many had suspected. The fire had been deliberately set. Empty kerosene cans were found behind the church, along with boot prints leading toward the railroad camp. But no one needed to ask who was responsible. They all knew. The town gathered in the hotel lobby as the sun rose, drawn together by shared gratitude and purpose. Pastor Emmett, his voice barely a whisper, called them to prayer. They knelt together, settlers and natives, miners and merchants, united in thanksgiving for lives saved and courage shown. Carter drifted in and out of awareness, but each time he opened his eyes, he saw something remarkable. Turner teaching Little Bear a hand game while Asha spoke with Sarah Emmett. Rough miners bringing coffee to native women. Children of both peoples curled together on blankets, sleeping peacefully while their parents kept watch. The church might have burned, but something stronger had risen from its ashes. Something that no fire could destroy. A community forged in crisis, tempered by mercy, strengthened by shared purpose. As morning light filled the room, Carter felt Ivy's hand slip into his. Despite his injuries, he smiled. They had walked through fire together and emerged transformed, not by violence or vengeance, but by the courage to risk everything for others, by choosing love over fear again and again, until it became as natural as breathing. Outside, snow began falling once more, covering the scorched earth with clean white powder. The church bell, though silent now, had done its work. Not just warning of danger, but calling them all to their better selves. Calling them home. The mountain cabin was quiet, except for the crackle of pine logs in the hearth. Carter lay in their bed, his bandaged hands resting on top of the quilt Ivy's mother had made for their wedding. The burns still throbbed, but Dr. Matthews's willow bark tea helped dull the worst of the pain. Outside, late winter sunshine filtered through the frost-covered windows, casting patterns on the wooden floor. Ivy moved quietly around the room, arranging fresh bandages and healing salves on the bedside table. Her fingers were gentle as she checked his forehead for fever. "The swelling's going down," she murmured, relief softening her voice. Carter tried to smile, though it pulled at his scorched skin. "Reckon I'll live then?" "Dr. Matthews says you will, though there'll be scars." She sat beside him, taking care not to jostle the bed. But scars are just proof we survived. Before Carter could respond, hoofbeats thundered outside. Ivy went to the window, pushing aside the curtain. Her breath caught. It's Sheriff Mills, and they've got Deputy Kersey. Carter struggled to sit up, ignoring the pain that shot through his burned hands and arms. Through the glass, he could see a group of riders approaching, not just the sheriff, but several men wearing railroad company badges. Between them rode Walt Kersey, his hands bound, his face twisted with rage and fear. They caught him trying to flee, Ivy said softly. Word is he was heading for the Kansas border when the railroad men found him. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The very company Kersey had tried to manipulate had turned against him. Carter watched as more townspeople emerged from their homes and businesses, drawn by the commotion. The crowd grew quickly, their angry murmurs carrying through the cold air. "Help me up," Carter said, his voice rough from smoke damage. "I need to be out there." Ivy hesitated. "You're still weak." "Please, Ivy." His eyes met hers. "This needs to end right." She nodded, understanding. With careful movements, she helped him dress, sliding his arms gently into a clean shirt, wrapping his coat around his shoulders. The simple acts took far longer than usual, each motion causing pain to flare through his burned skin. But Carter remained silent, focused on what needed to be done. Together they walked slowly down the path toward town. Carter leaned heavily on Ivy's arm, his strength not yet returned. By the time they reached the crowd gathered in front of the sheriff's office, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. The scene before them was tense. Kersey stood surrounded by guards, his once proud bearing reduced to desperate defiance. The gathered townspeople pressed closer, their faces hard with anger. Someone had brought rope. "Hang him!" a voice shouted from the crowd. "He tried to murder the pastor." "And Little Bear," another added. "An innocent child." The calls for vengeance grew louder. Sheriff Mills looked uncertain, clearly torn between law and the mob's fury. Pastor Emmett stood at the edge of the crowd, his throat still too damaged from smoke to speak above a whisper. Carter straightened, gathering what strength remained in his burned body. "No." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The crowd turned, falling silent at the sight of him. "No hanging," Carter continued, each word careful and clear. "No blood." Kersey's head snapped up, disbelief crossing his face. The deputy had clearly expected Carter to demand the harshest punishment possible. "He tried to kill you too," someone protested. "Burned down our church." "That's right," Carter agreed, his bandaged hands visible to all. "And he'll face justice for it. Real justice. Through the law." He paused, drawing a painful breath. "He'll face what I faced. Humiliation, not blood." The crowd stirred uneasily. Carter continued, his voice growing stronger. "When my wife was shamed, I wanted vengeance. God knows I did. But she showed me a better way. Mercy's way." His eyes found Kersey's. "You'll stand trial. You'll wear prison clothes instead of that deputy's badge you dishonored. You'll face the shame of your choices, same as I faced mine. And maybe if you're wise, you'll learn what I learned, that no man's stronger than the mercy he refuses to give." Pastor Emmett stepped forward, tears gleaming in his eyes. He couldn't speak above a hoarse whisper, but his nod of approval was clear to all. Sarah Emmett stood beside him, her hand clasped in his. The anger in the crowd began to fade, replaced by something deeper. They looked at Carter with new understanding, seeing not just the fearsome mountain man they'd once dreaded, but something more. A man who'd walked through fire, literally and spiritually, and emerged transformed. Sheriff Mills cleared his throat. The prison wagon will be here tomorrow. He'll face trial in Denver, proper and legal. Kersey sagged in his bonds, the fight leaving him. Perhaps he'd finally realized that Carter's mercy was a harder punishment than quick violence would have been. He would have to live with his shame, face it daily in the mirror of his prison cell. The crowd began to disperse, their thirst for vengeance dissolved by Carter's words. Some stopped to touch his shoulder gently or murmur words of respect. Asha approached with Little Bear, who was recovering well. The boy hugged Carter's legs carefully, mindful of his injuries. "Thank you for saving me," he said in careful English. Carter managed to smile, though it pulled at his burns. "You're welcome, little brother." By the time they made their way back home, Carter was exhausted. The short walk and emotional confrontation had drained what little strength he'd regained. Ivy helped him back to bed, her movements gentle and sure. As darkness fell, she tended his burns, unwrapping the old bandages and applying fresh salve. Her touch was cool against his heated skin. "You did a mighty thing today," she said softly, "choosing mercy again, even after everything." Carter watched her work, remembering how she'd done the same for others, friend and stranger alike, never seeking revenge even when wronged. "Learned it from you," he murmured. "Your forgiveness has healed more than just my skin." Ivy's hands stilled. She looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. God's mercy flows through all of us, if we let it, even through our scars. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady. But inside their cabin, warmth bloomed, not just from the hearth, but from the deeper healing of spirits renewed through love and forgiveness. Carter drifted toward sleep, his bandaged hands held gently in Ivy's own, at peace with the scars he would carry. They were marks not of violence, but of transformation. Proof that mercy's way, though harder, led to the truest kind of strength. Late March brought the first real thaw to Cold Creek. Snowmelt trickled down from the mountains, feeding hungry creeks that had run low all winter. The morning air still carried winter's bite, but afternoon sun coaxed green shoots from the softening earth. Nature itself seemed eager for renewal. Carter Lund stood at his cabin window, watching the town below. His burns had healed enough to let him work again, though the new skin pulled tight when he moved. The scars would stay with him always, much like the memories of that burning night. But they no longer pained him the way they once had. Through the glass, he could see Deputy Walt Kersey, now dressed in prison stripes, being marched toward the church ruins by 2 guards. The former lawman's shoulders slumped beneath his new uniform, his swagger replaced by shuffling steps. The Denver court had sentenced him to 6 months of work detail, rebuilding what he'd tried to destroy. "He's starting early today," Ivy observed quietly, coming to stand beside Carter. Her shawl was wrapped loosely around her head, protecting the still tender scalp where her hair was slowly growing back. The short fuzz caught morning light like silver thread. Carter nodded. "Pastor Emmett says they'll begin raising the new beams this week." He flexed his scarred hands carefully. "I aim to help. Are you certain you're strong enough?" Ivy's concern was gentle but clear. "Got to start somewhere." He touched her shoulder softly. "Besides, I reckon healing comes faster when you're working toward something good." They watched as more townspeople began gathering at the church site. Some carried tools, others brought food in covered baskets. What had started as a simple rebuilding project had grown into something larger, a daily gathering that drew folks from all corners of the community. Even some of the Ute families who usually kept their distance had begun joining in, bringing their own tools and sharing their knowledge of local timber. Ivy gathered her basket, filled with fresh water and cornbread. "I'd best head down too. Those workers will be thirsty before long." Carter watched her walk down the path, her steps steady and sure. Some of the town women who'd once turned away now called greetings, waiting to walk beside her. The sight warmed him more than any spring sun could. At the work site, the day's tasks were already being divided. Pastor Emmett, his voice still raspy from smoke damage, directed volunteers with careful gestures. The foundation had been cleared and new stone laid. Today they would begin raising the framework that would support the church's walls. Kersey worked apart from the others, breaking up charred timbers under the guards' watchful eyes. His face was streaked with ash and sweat, his hands raw from splinters. When Ivy approached with her water bucket, he flinched as if struck. "Here," she said quietly, holding out a tin cup. "You need to drink in this heat." Kersey couldn't meet her eyes. His hands trembled as he took the cup, spilling a few drops. "Much obliged," he mumbled, the words barely audible. Ivy simply nodded and moved on, offering water to others. But Carter, watching from where he'd begun to sand new boards for the pulpit, saw how that simple act of kindness seemed to weigh on Kersey more heavily than any prison sentence could. The morning wore on, filled with the rhythm of work. Saws rasped through fresh timber. Hammers rang against nails. The smell of wood shavings mixed with spring mud and wood smoke from the cooking fires. Little Bear, now fully recovered, darted between workers carrying messages and tools, his quick smile brightening the labor. Sarah Emmett organized the women preparing the midday meal, their cooking fire casting savory smoke skyward. Among them worked both settler wives and Ute mothers, sharing recipes and childcare with easy familiarity. The barriers that had once divided them seemed to melt away like winter snow in the warmth of shared purpose. Carter focused on the pulpit, carefully shaping each piece by hand. His burns made the work slower than he'd like, but there was satisfaction in the precision it required. Every stroke of the plane felt like a prayer, smoothing rough edges into something fine and true. "You have a good eye for wood," came a voice beside him. It was Grey Wolf, one of the Ute elders who'd been helping with the timber selection. The older man ran weathered fingers along the grain Carter had exposed. "The spirit flows clean here, like spring water." Carter nodded, honored by the praise. "Trying to make it worthy of its purpose." "All things carry purpose," Grey Wolf said thoughtfully, "even the hard seasons that shape us." His eyes drifted to where Kersey worked alone. Sometimes the greatest strength is in helping others find their way back to theirs. The wisdom in those words stayed with Carter as the days passed. Slowly, the church's skeleton rose against the sky. Each beam required many hands working together, settler and native, young and old, even the prison guards joining in when extra strength was needed. The shared labor broke down walls that words alone never could. Ivy continued bringing water to all who worked, Kersey included. Sometimes she would pause beside him, speaking quietly about simple things. The weather, the progress of the rebuilding, memories of the old church. At first he could barely respond, but as weeks passed, his shoulders gradually straightened. His eyes began to lift from the ground. One afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the worksite, Carter heard Kersey's voice crack with emotion. "I'm sorry," he said to Ivy, the words seeming to tear free from deep inside him. "What I did to you, there ain't no excuse for it." Ivy was silent for a long moment. "No," she agreed softly. "There wasn't. But there's always room for a new start, if you're willing to build it." Kersey wiped his eyes with a shaking hand. "I don't deserve such mercy." "None of us do," Ivy said. "That's what makes it mercy." The exchange was private, but its effect rippled through the community like rings in still water. Something shifted in the air after that day. A letting go of old poisons, a surrender to hope's quiet persistence. As April dawned, the church walls rose straight and true. Carter's pulpit took its place at the front, its clean lines drawing light like a prism. The congregation gathered to raise the cross above the door. Not the old iron one that had survived the fire, but a new one carved from local pine by both settler and Ute hands. Pastor Emmett's voice was stronger now as he led the blessing. Beside him stood his wife Sarah, Grey Wolf and his family, Carter and Ivy, and dozens more who had become family through shared labor. Even Kersey, still in his prison stripes but standing straighter now, bowed his head as the prayer rose skyward. Ivy's hand found Carter's as they watched the sun catch the new cross. Her shawl had slipped back, revealing the silver-white fuzz of new growth covering her scalp. She no longer tried to hide it. Like the church itself, like the town's spirit, like spring after winter. What had been destroyed was growing back, different perhaps, but no less beautiful for its scars. "Look there," Carter murmured, pointing to where a dove had landed on the fresh-cut shingles. The bird preened briefly in the sunlight before taking wing, rising into the endless Colorado sky. Each nail driven into wood had indeed become a hymn of forgiveness. Each beam raised by shared hands had strengthened more than just the building. The cycle of cruelty that had gripped their town through that long winter had been broken not by force, but by the steady persistence of mercy. The congregation began to sing, their voices carrying across the valley. Carter felt the vibration of it in his chest, saw it reflected in the faces around him. The quiet joy of people who had learned that rebuilding was not just about wood and nails, but about the courage to begin again, together. The new church gleamed in the April sunshine, its fresh-cut timber and gleaming windows a testament to shared labor and renewed spirit. Inside, light poured through the clear panes, catching dust motes that danced like holy spirits above the gathered congregation. Ivy sat in the front pew, her head uncovered now. Short, silver-brown curls had begun to spring from her scalp, catching the morning light like a crown. Carter's hand rested steady in hers, his work-roughened fingers gentle against her palm. The pews were packed tight, with miners seated next to settlers, and Ute families filling the spaces between. Little Bear squirmed between his mother and father, his small face bright with excitement. Even those who rarely attended church had come today, drawn by the power of what this building represented. Pastor Emmett stood at Carter's hand-carved pulpit, his voice carrying clear and strong through the hushed space. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "we gather today to dedicate not just these walls and beams, but the spirit of mercy that raised them." His eyes swept across the congregation. The Lord works in ways we cannot fathom. What began as cruelty became his hammer, shaping our hearts anew. The pastor's words brought quiet murmurs of agreement. In the back, Deputy Kersey sat with bowed head, his prison guard nearby. His shoulders shook slightly. When Carter rose to speak, the church fell silent. He stood at the pulpit, this feared mountain man now humbled by grace. "Folks reckon I'm strong," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, yet reaching every corner. "But my strength wasn't in my arms, but in her faith." He turned to Ivy, whose tears flowed freely now. "She taught me mercy's the hardest trail to ride, but it leads to the sweetest water." Sunlight streamed through the windows, painting rainbow patterns across the fresh-planed pews. Ivy held Carter's hand tighter as he returned to her side. Around them, the congregation sat transformed, no longer divided by old hatreds and fears, but united in the understanding that forgiveness was their shared redemption. Pastor Emmett raised his hands in blessing as the morning light filled every corner of their new sanctuary, built by many hands, consecrated by mercy's persistent grace. Evening settled soft and purple over the Lund cabin. Golden lamplight spilled from the windows, warming the April air with promises of fellowship and healing. Inside, the rough-hewn table groaned under the weight of Ivy's venison stew, fresh-baked cornbread, and Pastor Emmett's crusty loaf brought special for the occasion. Little Bear, Asha's son, sat between his mother and Carter, his eyes wide as he soaked up spoonfuls of rich broth. The boy's presence seemed to soften every corner of the cabin, bringing light to places that had known only shadow these past months. "The stew warms the spirit," Asha said in her gentle way, her English careful but clear. She reached across to squeeze Ivy's hand. "Like your kindness warmed mine, sister." Pastor Emmett broke off another piece of bread, sharing it around the table. "The Lord provides in unexpected ways," he said, his voice carrying the day's earlier reverence. "Sometimes through trials, sometimes through simple bread and fellowship." Laughter, hesitant at first, then growing bolder, filled the small room. It had been so long since these walls had heard such joy. Carter rose from his place, crossing to the corner where his fiddle hung. His burned hands, still healing, moved carefully over the instrument. The first notes trembled in the air, uncertain as new leaves. But as Carter found his rhythm, the music steadied, filling the cabin with an old trail song that spoke of home and hope. Little Bear clapped along, while Asha hummed, softly. Outside, the spring wind caught the church bell, drawing forth a distant, gentle ring that seemed to bless their gathering. As the evening drew to close, their guests departed with warm embraces and promises to return. Ivy and Carter stepped out onto their porch, watching the first stars pierce the darkening sky above the mountains. The air held the sweetness of pine and possibility. "We lived through fire," Ivy whispered, leaning into Carter's solid presence. He drew her close, his voice rough with emotion but steady as the ground beneath their feet. "And came out shining." Together they stood, watching night claims its gentle dominion over their healing land, while behind them, their cabin glowed like a beacon of grace realized. The late May sunrise painted golden squares across the cabin's plank floors, warming the rough-hewn walls that had weathered so much grief and joy. Ivy stood before the small mirror mounted beside their bed, her fingers trailing over the soft, downy growth of her returning hair. The stubble felt like velvet beneath her touch, catching the morning light like a crown of silver brown. She drew the horsehair brush through the short strands, remembering how that terrible day had changed everything. The memory no longer stung like it once had. Instead, it reminded her of God's endless capacity for healing. Her reflection showed a woman transformed, not by the cutting of her hair, but by the growing of her spirit. "They took my pride," she whispered to her reflection, voice steady and clear. "But the Lord gave me peace." The words felt right in her mouth, true as scripture. The floorboards creaked behind her, and Carter's broad frame appeared in the mirror. His hands, still bearing the pink scars from the church fire, came to rest over hers on the brush handle. The gentle weight of his touch spoke volumes, of protection, of reverence, of a love that had only deepened through their trials. "And gave me back my wife," Carter murmured, his voice rough with emotion. His eyes met hers in the mirror's surface, holding generations of tenderness in their depths. He leaned down, pressing his lips to her reflection, right where her image showed. The gesture made Ivy's heart flutter like it had when they'd first courted. Through the cabin walls came the sweet pealing of the rebuilt church's bell, its tone pure and strong in the morning air. The sound carried memories of that dedication day, of hands joined in prayer, of mercy freely given and gratefully received. Children's laughter followed the bell's song, the sound of new life, of hope taking root in once bitter soil. Ivy moved to the window, feeling the warmth of Carter's presence behind her. She unlatched the wooden frame, pushing it wide to welcome the spring breeze. The scent of pine and wildflowers drifted in, along with the distant bleating of old Widow Morrison's goats and the cheerful calling of meadowlarks. Their cabin, once feared as the mountain man's fortress, now stood as something altogether different. Smoke rose welcoming from its chimney, and hardly a day passed without visitors seeking counsel or comfort. Even the Ute families would stop by, sharing meat and medicine, their children playing in the yard, while the adults spoke of bridges built between their peoples. "Remember when folks used to cross the street to avoid our gate?" Ivy asked, leaning back against Carter's chest. His arms encircled her waist, strong and sure. "The Lord has strange ways of making a home into a refuge," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "Strange ways of turning fear into faith." More laughter drifted up from the town below, the sound of Pastor Emmett's youngest grandchildren chasing each other around the new churchyard. The building stood proud against the mountain backdrop, its fresh-cut timber still golden in the morning light. Every beam and board had been placed with prayer, every nail driven with purpose. Even the window Ivy looked through now held its own miracle. After the fire, the town's glassmaker had crafted new panes for their cabin, refusing payment. "Your mercy taught us all," he'd said, pressing the glass into Carter's scarred hands. "Let the light shine through proper." Ivy's fingers found Carter's where they rested against her middle. She traced the healing burns, remembering how close she'd come to losing him that terrible night. Yet even then, God's grace had proved sufficient. The scars were badges now, not of violence but of sacrifice, of a man who'd walked through fire to save others. The morning breeze lifted the curtains Asha had helped her sew, white cotton dancing like praise flags in the wind. Below, the town of Cold Creek stirred to full wakefulness, no longer divided, no longer breeding malice in its shadows. The railroad had found another route, leaving their mountain in peace. Even Deputy Kersey, after serving his sentence, had left a changed man, heading east with shame replaced by hard-won wisdom. "We should get ready for service," Carter said softly, though neither moved from their embrace. The morning sun bathed them both in light, turning the cabin into a sanctuary of second chances. Ivy turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his weathered face. "I love you, Carter Lund," she said simply. "Through fire and frost, through all of it." He bent to kiss her properly this time, not just her reflection. When he pulled back, his eyes shone with unshed tears. "My Ivy," he whispered, blooming stronger than ever. The church bell rang again, calling the faithful to worship. Through their open window, spring continued its gentle invasion, bringing with it all the promise of renewal, all the power of grace freely given and humbly received. Their cabin stood transformed, much like their hearts, no longer a place of isolation, but a beacon of faith and mercy in a land that had learned the hard way that love was the strongest force of all. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.